thank you all for coming. I don't think I need to introduce myself, but there are a few people who I don't recognize. So my name is Sanjot Mahendale. I'm the chair of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. And so this year, the Tang Center's annual theme is science, medicine, and technology. So we're focusing on the transfer of knowledge along the Eurasian trading networks that are commonly referred to as the Silk Road. And so today I'm very happy to welcome Dominic Stiavu, Associate Professor of Chinese Religion and Chinese Buddhism in the Departments of Religious Studies and East Asian Languages and Cultural Studies at UC Santa Barbara. His main area of interest is the intersection of Taoism, Chinese Buddhism, and the history of medicine. Dominic Stiavu received both his MA and PhD in religious studies from Stanford University, so he is very familiar with this area and also with the Berkeley campus. He's the author of many publications, including most recently a monograph titled The Writ of the Three Sovereigns, From Local Lore to Institutional Taoism, which was published a few years ago in the new Taoist Studies series by the University of Hawaii Press. Among his articles on medicine and healing practices are the forthcoming Is There Such a Thing as Chinese Yoga? Indian Postural Therapies in Medieval China, to be published in the Journal of Yoga Studies. Also, paratextuality, materiality, and corporeality in medieval Chinese religions, talismans and diagrams, the marvelous fungus and the secret of divine immortals, Buddhist medicine and the affairs of the heart, imprints of Ayurvedic potency therapy in medieval Chinese sources. He has also contributed many book chapters, including in 2017, Apotropaic Substances as Medicine in Buddhist Healing Methods, Nagarjuna's treatise on the five sciences. And in 2016, Delocalizing Illness, Healing and the State in Chinese Magical Medicine. He has lectured extensively on Buddhist medicine practices across Asia, and today we'll speak on the relationship between Buddhism and the globalization of medieval medicine. So please help me welcome Dominic.
Thank you, Dr. Mahendale, and for this wonderful introduction, and Dr. Billet as well, for inviting me here. I want to thank also the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies and Buddhist Studies, who co-sponsored this event. And thank you everyone who made their way over here tonight to share some of this research, some of it new, some of it not as new. I hope that we can have a nice conversation afterwards, and I'm looking forward to your comments. So I'm going to jump right into it. In the broadest of terms, the talk today is going to be about the circulation of medical or therapeutic knowledge and practices across cultural boundaries. In the medieval world, of course, we're focusing on Central Asia, South Asia, and East Asia. And the talk will also be about the resulting reformulation or renegotiation of that knowledge and the associated practices. So more specifically, just to kind of zero in on things and make it a bit clearer, we're going to be looking at two case studies. The first one is about the reception of Ayurvedic sexual potency therapies, known as Vajikarana. Their reception in China, and how Buddhism acted as the vector, or Buddhists acted as the vector of this transmission, and how this new knowledge, this new therapeutic knowledge, had a measurable, visible impact on Chinese medicine. Now, full disclosure, I've written about this, and most of, or a lot of the talk is based on this article that I published a few years ago, 2017. So if you're interested in this topic, you can read the article. It's in EASTM, East Asian science, technology, and medicine. The second topic, however, will be based on newer research, and this is related to an article that will come out probably by the end of the year or early next year. So if you have comments on the second case study especially, I'd be very appreciative. I think I have to hand in the corrected proofs at the end of the weekend, so there's still time to save me from making very grave mistakes. And indeed, the second topic will be on the, and I write potential here, it's still somewhat unclear, but potential reception of early yoga, quote unquote. And what I mean by that are postural therapies, self-cultivation, therapeutic practices that impact health that are based on what is known as asanas in the Indic context, and how these may have made their way to China. At the very least, I hope to show that we can conclude that the Chinese knew about the existence of such postural therapies in India by the 6th century, which is pretty early, considering that most written sources in India only start to develop postural therapies in about the 11th century. But I'll get into that later. Again, Buddhism is a major, or Buddhists are a major vector of this influx of new ideas. All right, so starting off with a bit of background information about sexual therapies. In China, before the arrival of Buddhism, you have two broad categories of issues, and therapies address these two broad categories of issues. The first one is physiological dysfunctions. And by this I mean, in the examples, it's right there, stuff like erectile dysfunction, pain during intercourse, infertility, premature climax, microphilus, things of that nature. So, what we would call medical issues nowadays, but they're very physiologically grounded. There's always a combination of physiological with psychological, of course, but for all intents and purposes in this talk, we can define them as physiological dysfunctions. And these sexual therapies are classified as a subcategory of nourishing life. Nourishing life is a kind of catch-all paramedical set of disciplines that involves things like dietetics, like pharmacology, like breathing techniques, like Daoyin, which we'll talk about in the second part of the lecture, and also the arts of the bedchamber, which is basically what we're talking about here when we're talking about these recipes, these prescriptions for curing, right? And I put those in bold because that's the focus of these prescriptions, curing physiological dysfunctions, and they fall under the category of bedchamber arts, or arts of the bedchamber, in early and classical China before the influx of Buddhism. A detail of some importance, the texts are primarily destined or addressed to a male readership. So something to keep in mind. This is a very typical example of a passage from the Maongdui manuscripts. It's not my translation, it's Don Harper's translation. But this is what we're talking about when we're talking about these prescriptions for curing physical impediments to intercourse or to reproduction. I'm not going to go through it because there's a bunch of these and I want to keep on time. So the first one was physiological dysfunctions. The second issue that is addressed in pre-Buddhist China when we're talking about sexual therapies is what we can term affective asymmetries. These are both of them are not terms that exist in classical Chinese. It's just what I label them as. I've done a fair amount of research into these sources, and I've come up with these two broad categories. I call them something else in the article, but we don't need to concern ourselves with that right now. And this is completely different. So when we're dealing about affective asymmetries, basically, going down to the bottom there, we're talking about unrequited love, marital issues, right? So someone doesn't love someone else anymore, or if someone is really enamored with someone else and that person isn't interested, you have prescriptions or recipes to make that person interested, artificially, non-consensually. So this type of prescription is concerned not with healing, but with charming, not with curing, right, but with spellbinding. So it falls under the broad category, and these are emic categories in the literature of witchcraft or spellbinding. And this is where they're classified usually when we're looking at bibliographic treatises and things like that. They are collectively referred to, these prescriptions that address affective asymmetries, they're referred to as the way of seduction. And this, in contrast to the more paramedical one that we looked at a second ago, are associated primarily with women. So there's a strong connection in the literature, at least. Whether or not it was the case on the ground is another question, but in the literature between witchcraft and women in early and up to early medieval China. Here again, we have a kind of sample of what these prescriptions entail. Same general layout. The focus is more on sympathetic magic rather than medically active substances, but this isn't a hard and fast rule. Sometimes you do have medically active compounds that show up, or substances, in these recipes. But this would be what we're talking about. I'm just going to do the first one. Take 4 nails from the left claw of a male dove and 4 nails from the left hand of a young girl. Scorch them in a saucepan, combine them, and smith them. Apply them to the person, and the person will be obtained. Again, this is Don Harper's translation from Ma Wangdui manuscript. So we have a tension or opposition between these medico-therapeutic prescriptions that are associated with healing physiological dysfunctions associated with intercourse, and on the other hand, a more technical, magical prescription that is associated with affective asymmetries. And as I was trying to point out, despite the kind of taxonomic or bibliographic distinction that you have between these two, in actuality, if you read them, they share many, many similarities. They both have this prescription or fang format. They rely on the processing of vegetal, mineral, animal, and human substances, as we saw the nail clippings in the previous example. Both of them rely on symbolic or sympathetic magic, as well as bioactive codes of efficacy, albeit in different proportions. And you have the same way of applying these prescriptions, or the product of these prescriptions or recipes, either topically or internally. So again, lots of similarities between them. Now, moving on to Buddhism. This was the picture of what's going on before Buddhism arrives. In the Buddhist world, of course, there's a long-standing relation between Buddhism and medicine, in South Asia particularly, in this case. The Buddha is often described as a physician, and of course, suffering is the illness of existence, and Dharma is the medicine that heals that suffering. Buddhist monasteries, again, more concretely, were in South Asia and East Asia later on, sites of healing as well. So that's where you had practicing physicians. Many, not all, but many of them were Buddhist monks. And Buddhist monasteries were also sites of circulation, exchange of medical knowledge. And in India, you have a closely linked history of development between Ayurveda and Buddhism. Now, this close relation between Buddhism and medicine transfers to China as well once Buddhism comes in. And Buddhism brings in Ayurvedic or notions related to Ayurvedic medicine along with the more kind of theological notions that we associate with Buddhism as a religion. So we have, just as a very generic examples, a whole section of texts in the Taisho Tripitaka that are concerned with Buddhist medicine, ophthalmology especially. There's a lot of them that kind of were preserved, related to eye health, but not only obstetrics and so on and so forth. There's a variety of Buddhist medical sources, and we see this in Dunhuang manuscripts as well, where the picture is a bit different than what we have in the canonical context. Now, traditionally, the 8 disciplines of Ayurvedic medicine are described as the following. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's debate about when they emerge. So the 8 sections of Ayurvedic medicine. They appear in some form or another around 500 CE, and then start to take shape, especially around the 7th century, so about 100 years later, 100 or 200 years later. The one that interests us here is the last one, called potency therapy, Vajikarana. Now, these appear in Chinese materials very early on. So if you look at basically the first time that they are recorded, not orally, but in written form in India, they appear in China about 100 years later at the most. And all of these that are in bold actually correspond to, in some form or another, to the original 8 divisions or 8 branches, except for the last one. So potency therapy in this early account by Bao Liang is replaced with astronomical divination, at least in the canonical form of this text. We have about a century later, Yi Jing, who presents, he has 2 accounts of the 8 branches of Ayurveda in 2 different texts, and here too they all correspond, and he brings in potency, which he describes as, so in the Indic materials, potency therapy is more or less very clearly referring to sexual potency. And in the Chinese source, if you look at the Chinese, it's a bit more ambiguous in both cases. So the green is from the second text, the green tiles are from the second text, and the blue is from the first text. It's quoted here, over there. But the point I'm making is that you have already by Yi Jing's time clear evidence that these disciplines were known in China. Whether or not they were practiced is another question. What impact they had, also another question, but they knew about these. And they knew about what potency therapy was. So, Ayurvedic typology is present and circulating in some form from at least the 500s in China. What we see from the archive is that they are at first restricted to Buddhist medical sources, and this is especially the case in Dunhuang materials. So we have one text here, P3914, that is a Buddhist manuscript. I don't want to call it necessarily a medical manuscript, but it has pronounced medical or therapeutic concerns. And it has no recipes for physiological dysfunctions, right? So the types of things that would be addressed in China by Nourishing Life, Yang Sheng, or the Arts of the Bedchamber, don't appear in these Dunhuang texts. The types of things that would usually be classified as the way of seduction, right? Spellbinding or witchcraft do appear. And they appear in between prescriptions for things that are thoroughly medical, dyspepsia, for instance. And we have the following: if you love someone, take 2 tsuen of the wood of Cyrus, cut it into 108 pieces. So this is symbolic, of course, meaning reciting the spell every time you divide it. The spell is provided above. When roasting the pieces in the fire, call out the other person's name. Proceed likewise on the double hour. 1 double hour per day for 3 days, and this person will immediately love another person, referring to you, until death, or enough to kill themselves, as the Chinese says. So from the Chinese point of view, it's quite striking to find this recipe here that you would have associated with witchcraft or spellbinding in a medical context. But that is indeed the case. So I have a few examples in the article. I'm not going to go through all of them. But if you're interested, you're more than invited to do so. So Buddhist medical manuscripts from Dunhuang, it seems, follow Ayurvedic classificatory conventions, right? So they follow the Indian medical conventions in classifying their content, including recipes for effective asymmetries, i.e. seduction, as medical pursuits. Right. On the other hand, non-Buddhist, non-medical, so just other types of Chinese manuscripts that we find at Dunhuang have a different way of classifying things. They follow, obviously, Chinese classificatory conventions that distinguish between the paramedical prescriptions of Nourishing Life and the way of seduction. So this is another example from a manuscript that's titled Secret Methods for Seizing Women and Wives. If a wife wishes to make her husband love her, so in this case it's the opposite, it's the wife who is seizing a husband, she should obtain the soil from the paws of a family dog and administer it under her husband's navel. He will then love his wife. If only it were so simple. All right, so not a big surprise there that those original taxonomies or classification conventions are maintained. But more interestingly, what about non-Buddhist Chinese medical sources? So medical sources that obviously address therapeutic concerns, but that are not Buddhist. Here we see something a bit more surprising. So another manuscript from Dunhuang is a medical manuscript. It's not Buddhist. It provides therapies for obstetrics, pediatrics, the treatment of malaria, hemorrhoids, things like that. So medical. Yet it also contains therapies related to intercourse and methods that traditionally fell under the rubric of the way of seduction. So this is a bit more surprising. Again, there's no Buddhist context in this manuscript. And here we have the recipe which echoes the previous one. If a husband hates his wife, then take a rat's tail and incinerate it so that it is reduced to ashes. Then take these ashes and mix them with ale. Present this to the husband for ingestion, and he will immediately love his wife. So, from the local context, we have in places like Dunhuang evidence that, or at least inklings, maybe I should use inklings rather than evidence, that Buddhism brought Ayurvedic notions or South Asian therapeutic medical notions into China from around the 500s, perhaps earlier, but there isn't anything datable to that effect. These did not make an immediate impact on Chinese culture writ large, but they first remained circumscribed to Buddhist medical manuscripts, primarily. And more surprisingly, it seems that non-Buddhist Chinese medical manuscripts from around the same period also started adopting some of these notions that came in. What about beyond the local context? Did this influx of new knowledge impact official elite traditions, be they religious, medical, or other? Yeah, there's a lot of these at Dunhuang, as in the previous slide here. It seems to have been, a topic of predilection at Dunhuang, this scene of patients receiving medical treatment. So there's a whole range of them to choose from. So I think I have 2 or 3 of them. So if you look at canonical Buddhist texts from the Taisho Tripitaka, there's only 1 or 2 instances, so I write here almost never, do they address physiologically grounded sexual dysfunctions. Right? So those types of dysfunctions that would be considered paramedical do not appear in canonical Buddhist texts, despite Buddhism having a very close association with medicine. So we have some prescriptions concerning gynecology, urology, obstetrics, but nothing directly related to intercourse. And this is also the case, again, surprisingly, in Dunhuang manuscripts. Perhaps, most probably, on account of theological positions on intercourse, right? So if you reproduce, obviously, you're extending or prolonging the cycle of rebirth and samsara. That's not good from the Buddhist point of view. Yeah, I had another few hypotheses about that, but we'll get to those maybe later, about why they wouldn't be included. More surprisingly, oh, and here's an image of actually not a patient, but an animal patient. It's a camel receiving medical treatment. So there's instances of veterinary medicine as well in cave paintings at Dunhuang. So more surprisingly, in contrast to Dunhuang manuscripts, where we saw that the way of seduction, all these prescriptions for effective asymmetries were included in medical texts, in canonical Buddhist texts, this doesn't happen. So effective asymmetries are not discussed in a medical or therapeutic context in canonical sources. They do appear in the Taisho Tripitaka, but they usually fall under the aegis of spellbinding or divination. So you have things like chanting Dharani, again, not in a medical context, for eliciting love, the love of another, or you have the manipulation of divination boards as well, in which you can generate feelings of affection in others. And this extends also, it's interesting, not only to someone that you would be enamored with, but if you want the attention of a superior or a local official or a ruler, you can manipulate these divination boards and then they'll suddenly like you and give you a promotion. So when it comes to potency therapy, and in contrast to Buddhist sources, manuscript Buddhist sources, canonical Buddhist sources actually reify indigenous categories, right? Which is something that we didn't see in manuscript culture. It's, in fact, the opposite. So this shouldn't be too surprising. There's a certain level of conservatism that comes with elite Buddhist circles, the text producing or text editing circles at least. We know this, that when texts were included in the canon, they were heavily redacted, and so this would be some of the stuff that would be redacted. On the contrary, we have evidence here of the plasticity and receptivity of local manuscript cultures. Another reason, very quickly, why I think this is the picture that emerges is because, at least at the official level, Buddhism would not want to start messing around with indigenous categories when it came to anything, right? They were trying to show, at least in the early medieval period, how compatible Buddhism was with local Chinese traditions. So they wouldn't pick a fight over how to classify potency therapy or things like that. In fact, they would try and show that, they have the same views about these things. So this is not something that would be very high on their list of Chinese ideas to overturn. So, of course, when it comes to Chinese medicine, we would expect Chinese medicine, right? So elite official sources of Chinese medicine to be just as conservative as canonical Buddhist ones, if not more conservative. Yet, we find the opposite. So, I'll get to that in a second. First, when you look at early treatises before Buddhism comes in, there is no mention of recipes to aid sexual function, right, since these belong to Nourishing Life, which is a different genre, or the Way of Seduction, right? Arts of the Bedchamber are a subgenre of Nourishing Life. Right, so we find no evidence of this in early medical treatises. Some of the earlier medieval texts largely follow this same pattern. They build on the early Chinese treatises. But in this text here, Zhao Yuanfang's treatise on the origins and symptoms of diseases, dated to 610, the topic of physiological impediments is skirted. It's mentioned very obliquely, but overall it's ignored. Now, shortly thereafter, about 42 years later, we have a turning point with Sun Tzu Miao's Essential Recipes for Urgent Need, worth 1,000 cash. So from this point onward, things completely change. This text incorporates recipes that directly relate to sexual dysfunction. Things like genital sores, genital pain, vaginal dryness that are, I don't want to say, the sexual context is not explicitly referred, but these are the types of things that would be an impediment to intercourse. And it's made very clear in the source. So they're fully medicalized, yet not overtly associated with intercourse, right? But contextually so. So they're considered, or they fall under the category of primarily obstetric and gynecological issues or urological issues as well. And they notably show up in the chapter on ladies' recipes. So here we have an absorption of this early Yangsheng, Arts of the Bedchamber, Nourishing Life paramedical tradition that is now fully medicalized. And this is of some consequence. Sun Tzu Miao was a physician primarily, but he was also a Buddhist enthusiast. He was a devout lay practitioner. He was very familiar with Buddhist notions, Buddhist theology, Buddhist practices, and Buddhist texts. He was also very familiar with Taoism and Taoist texts as well. He's considered, a perfected, as you see in this image here, of Taoism. So he's celebrated in Taoism as well. But he had, and I go over this in more detail in the article, but he tried to Buddhify, if that term exists, Chinese medicine by bringing in notions of compassion and empathy that were previously not discussed, at least not in treatises or the treatises that survive. And he had he cites Buddhist notions directly, so it's not a coincidence, I think, that he starts to incorporate some of these Ayurvedic views into his work. Now, taxonomic reshuffling intensifies during the Tang. Sun Simiao's text was very influential, and it was a reference for subsequent medical treatises. So if they would copy or if they relied on that text, then they would mimic a lot of its taxonomic divisions. And you have also the further circulation of Ayurvedic knowledge that happens from the local to the general or the metropolitan, however you want to set it up. But this shows up in this text from the 8th century, Addenda to the Materia Medica, in which seduction drugs, right, so those prescriptions that address affective asymmetries, are fully integrated into a medical and therapeutic context. This doesn't sound like a big deal when you read it up on that slide, but this is a sea change in medieval or classical Chinese medicine. It's a very substantial and significant difference from previous tendencies. And we have, by the 10th century, here, relying on the Japanese medical anthology that's known as the Methods from the Heart of Medicine. So this is a Japanese anthology, but it relies almost exclusively on Chinese sources, Chinese medical treatises, and a lot of sources that are lost. So it's an invaluable resource for getting a kind of snapshot of what medieval classical Chinese medicine looked like. And in this text, we have again, this trend continues, a full integration and medicalization of both types of recipes. Well, let's start with the sexual dysfunctions first. Regardless of gender, up until then there were still some divisions related to gender. So they appear in chapters concerning women's health as well as men's health indiscriminately. And they're kind of peppered throughout the text in a variety of different chapters, so they're fully integrated. This is one of the recipes that we find there. Give it up, or I can read it. A method for those who wish to make male genitals larger: take shu pepper, wild ginger, and the meat of indulgence, which is a type of plant. Powder and strain all three of them and place them inside a dog's bladder to hang and dry for 30 days. Then you take out the powder, polish the member, and it will grow by 1 liang. So that amounts to, this is, usually it's a measure for volumes. And it varies by period. I calculated this once, but I don't remember how much it is. Yeah, but it's not that much. Not that it matters. Yeah, or maybe it does. I don't know. It also medicalizes recipes on affective asymmetries, right? So the same source, the Ishinpo. So these kind of remain lumped together with other methods which would have been previously considered spellbinding, so stuff like exorcism. Let's do the first one. Take the heart of a mandarin duck and dry it in the shade for 100 days. Tie it to your arm, but do not let anyone know about it. There will be mutual affection between you and the object of your intentions, right? So again, you see the sympathetic magic at work here. The other one involves writing the name of someone on a sheet of paper and drinking its ashes. So since these types of methods are still included with other kind of exorcistic medical methods, you have these traces of the old cleavages that remain. Again, the Methods from the Heart of Medicine is a summa, it's an anthology of previous sources, so not all the sources that it quotes fully integrated medically, at least, these recipes from the Way of Seduction, but in the way that it puts them together, more or less, I mean, they're medically contextualized, so they've become a branch of medicine. But the sources that it borrows from, not always. And what's interesting is that many of the sources for these types of recipes on effective asymmetries are Buddhist. Some of them canonical, local, many of them non-canonical and local. A lot of these are lost. So one of them is Nagarjuna's Recipes, for example, that has a number of prescriptions in the Ishinpo, but yeah, we no longer have access to that text. Some of these are also Taoist, but we don't need to necessarily get into that. Yeah, a lot of these are lost as well, or non-canonical. Chinese medicine did not adopt Ayurvedic categories wholesale, obviously. It did respond, however, to the influx of these new categories and adapted them, or adapted its way of approaching certain therapies that were part of the Chinese landscape before that. So via Buddhism and its presence along the Silk Roads, Indian medical notions impacted a permeable and indigenous, especially local Chinese tradition. And then those impacts made their way, or made waves up until the larger medical tradition. The massive temple networks that spread throughout South, Central, North, and East Asia facilitated this circulation of knowledge, undoubtedly. We had, regular trans-regional pilgrimages from kingdom to kingdom, which guaranteed interchange and the circulation of knowledge via texts, scriptures, travel logs, oral transmission, material culture, and so on and so forth. Buddhist monks also functioned as diplomats and emissaries, especially in China, but not exclusively, since they had all of these networks and connections to other Buddhists from neighboring kingdoms. And they published reports as well, briefed courts, so this was another way in which this type of knowledge was spread and globalized. So the Silk Roads, we can look at them not only as trade routes, but also as pilgrimage routes and diplomatic channels, physical diplomatic channels, literally. This is just a quick example of how Xuanzang, his pilgrimage route, which he took in the Tang Dynasty, actually maps out onto a good part of the Silk Roads, at least in the Central Asian part. With, and he was stopping obviously at the same outposts that you had on the Silk Roads where trade was being conducted. So that's nothing revolutionary, but it's interesting to kind of visualize it like this. The third point also is that the actors in this circulation of knowledge were not only Buddhists, but also non-Buddhist locals who were very open to new types of knowledge from outside of China. So Sun Simiao is a good example of this. And they were just as instrumental as Buddhists in circulating and generating acceptance for this new knowledge. So much in the same way, through these networks, through the circulation of knowledge via Buddhist agents, Buddhism also played a role in the transmission of Indian notions related to postural therapies, right? So, yeah, what we would call yoga nowadays. However, there was a long history of indigenous Chinese postural therapies that are referred to as guiding breath and stretching limbs or stretching the body, Dao Yin in Chinese. And this too was part of nourishing life practices, like the arts of the bedchamber. And from the outset, some of the earliest references to Dao Yin are, for example, in the Zhuangzi, which is roughly 4th century BCE. They're used, these stretches and guiding of breath, these postures are used in a therapeutic context, so for healing purposes. And they were developed, of course, in a number of medieval sources. The Yangsheng Yaoji we're going to go back to, that's the first one. And then we already spoke about the Zhu Bingyuan Hou Lun. The sources don't matter that much at this point. So Sun Simiao returns again with his essential recipes for urgent need worth 1,000 cash. He records 18 postures that are titled self-massage method. And by massage, this is more or less interchangeable with Dao Yin. He's referring to Dao Yin, this guiding and stretching, these postural self-cultivation practices that increase longevity and health. And we'll see what they consist of. Now, what's interesting is that you have this long, illustrious Chinese, indigenous Chinese tradition of Dao Yin, which is recognized and celebrated. Everyone knows about it. Yet, he adds this very intriguing annotation. And he says, this is the massage or a massage from the Sindhu kingdom, which is an anachronistic way of referring to India. Thus, a Brahmanic method. And again, Brahmanic refers to anything that is Indian in those days. If you take a look at the postures, right, we'll just look at 3. Would the hands do as if drawing a 5-stone bow on the left and right sides? Right, so you're just kind of stretching out the arms. You're supposed to be breathing in and out at certain times as well. The second position is seated, and then you bend the body and incline it as if pushing aside a mountain with one hand, and you do this with the left and right alike, so you do it side to side, you're pushing away mountains. And then the third one, pushing off the ground with both hands while on your knees, you look back to one side, and this is the method of the tiger gazing. Do it on the left and right side, so you're just on your knees and stretching out your neck and your back, rounding it out. So these seem to be very typical Dao Yin postures that we found described in some of the earlier sources or illustrated. There's a chart, I think I have an image of it at some point, dated to 168 BCE, before the Common Era, so before Buddhism comes in. And these seem to be more in line with that. Nothing is apparently foreign. Why would they be described as Indian? Especially in light of the indigenous tradition. This took a bit of digging, but this section from Sun Simiao's text draws on an earlier text dated to the 4th century called Dao Lin's Essay on Preserving Life. It has many of the same postures with minor differences. The text is not cited, but the 2 sections, the one that precedes the section on self-massage and the one that follows it, both cite this text. And again, many of the postures appear in that text, in Dao Lin's Essay on Preserving Life. So it seems that he took the Dao Yin section from that source as well. Still, where's the connection to India? Well, we have to find out who Daolin is. Now, there's some debate about this, and some scholars disagree. Some scholars think that he is a Taoist immortal from the Han Dynasty, and others believe that he is actually Zhedun, also known as Zhi Daolin, who was a Buddhist who lived around the same time in the 4th century that this source was penned, Daolin's essay. What is more, we know that Daolin was actually familiar with Taoism, especially the Zhuangzi, and also with certain nourishing life practices, especially pharmacology, so the ingestion of herbs and things like that. By the 4th century, this figure, Zhedun, is considered a Taoist immortal in certain Taoist texts. The Zhenggao mentions him as an illustrious figure. So there's a close connection between this Buddhist figure and Yangsheng practices and Taoist sources. He also had, as a Buddhist monk, direct access to Central Asian as well as Indian sources, presuming that he knew Sanskrit. This is hypothetical, of course. There's no way of verifying it, but there's a good chance that he did. Or he heard from first-hand pilgrims coming back from Central Asia or India. He was not Indian himself, he was Chinese. So again, there's some controversy surrounding his identity, but even people who don't believe that it refers to the Buddhist Daolin, people who believe that Daolin is actually a Taoist from the Han Dynasty, would say the following: whoever Daolin was, it appears that he was in contact with immigrant health practices during the Wei Jin period, right? At the time of extensive foreign influx and influence. And this is from Michael Stanley Baker, who has a passage in his MA thesis on this topic. So even him, he's not convinced that Daolin's essay was written by a Buddhist monk, but he has to concede this point. Whoever Daolin was, he also became a patriarch of Daoyin, and he's closely associated with some of these core Taoist sources like the Yangsheng Yaoji, which is lost, on which later Daoyin sources drew. And so he was famously associated with that into the Tang. So I believe that Sun Simiao likely drew a connection between the postural practices from Daolin's essay and India on account of Daolin's being a Buddhist author, and him having this contact with immigrant health practices. That is, both of these points are presumed. What most likely happened, though, was that the earlier non-canonical, and this is pure speculation on my part, so you can take me apart in the questions and answers. The earlier non-canonical recension of Daolin's essay, which is included in the Taoist canon, to which Sun Simiao had access, referred to the postures as being Indian, and this would have been taken out of the canonical version. Or Daolin's essay, which relies on this lost collected essentials on nourishing life, the Yangsheng Yaoji, that's established. So it's a lost text, and probably that lost text referred to those postures as being Indian in origin. Very quickly, there's another example from the archive that mentions these Brahmanic guiding and stretching methods. It's recorded in the collected records on conserving life by Wang Zhongqiu. And here we see, I put a selection of, again, the drawing the bow thing, which now has a title called Dragon Stretching. And it's mixed with another method in which you push both hands above your head and then you stretch them out on one side. So the posture is present. It's a bit more elaborate. The tiger gazing one is there too. It's a bit more fleshed out than in Sun Simiao's text. But what we need to remember is that a lot of these, I don't think that Wang Zongxiu goes back to Sun Simiao's text. I think he's relying on the same core source, either Daolin's essay or the previous one, the Collected Essentials on Nourishing Life. And either of these most probably referred to these specific methods as coming from India. Okay, so it's impossible to actually ascertain how much of those methods were Indian, if they were Indian at all. Maybe they were just labeled so, but I wonder why would something be labeled as coming from India if you already had a very established, illustrious indigenous tradition of Daoyin. At any rate, they were probably different from the original postures that would have been from India, and they were adapted to local markets and adapted to what Daoyin was perceived as accomplishing in China. At the very least, it shows that by the 6th century, the Chinese had knowledge of the existence of Indian asana postural therapies. And this is significant, again, because the earliest written account of asanas in India dates to the 11th century, right? So about 500 years before that. People bring up the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras that are dated to around 600 or 500 in some cases, but there are no postural therapies in there. So in the Yoga Sutras, they describe sitting in meditation, and that's a form of yogic practice. So they don't talk about movement. So that would be something different. So Hatha Yoga primarily is the first type of yoga that brings up these postural movements and therapies, and that's dated in, about to the 11th century. So in conclusion, Buddhists, as well as non-Buddhist local enthusiasts, were crucial links in the transmission chains of medical therapeutic knowledge between China and India. This happened along the Silk Roads, around maritime routes or other routes as well. But the transmission chains are not restricted to China and India. We tend to, or at least I have looked at them in that way, and that's a bit simplistic. We should also include Tibet, other parts of Central Asia, Persia especially, and beyond. Unfortunately, I don't have the linguistic capacities to deal with any of those materials, but we do need some kind of collaborative projects to untangle these knots. So this is kind of interesting. I don't have that much time to go through it, but maybe Professor Dalton can help me out here in the Q&A section. But there's a 15th century compendium of Samantabhadra's intent that has some descriptions of postural movements. And here we have a chart or an illustration that is based on that, on those descriptions. And we have the bow pose, for example, that shows up. This is the translation by Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton. So, you can argue that's just like this generic thing that people would come up with when they're trying to do stretches. But you do have it show up in a variety of sources. And my point being, my final point, is that we have tended to look at these types of interchange as on the basis of centralized models, information going from one center, China, going to India, or from India going to China, not looking at them bilaterally, not looking at them from a multipolar perspective, which I think is more useful, in which you would bring a constellation of centers or poles that have multilateral forms of exchange or circulation of knowledge. But this also presumes kind of centers, right? These big core points from which information leaves and maybe it doesn't come back in at the same rate. There's a type of hierarchy that's implicit here. So what I propose is that the most that we, or there would be the most to gain from a more global integrated perspective when dealing with medieval materials that would include China, India, Tibet, Persia, Japan, Europe as well, other parts of the Middle East, parts of Africa as well. And here we would have something more like a distributed network that would kind of place everything in connection without necessarily establishing a hierarchy in any of these points or establishing centers versus peripheral nodes and so on and so forth. A little closing comment is that these models of information exchange that I've shown here are actually from the RAND memorandum, which was used as basically the basis for creating the internet. So you could see perhaps the Silk Roads as being a pre-modern instantiation of a globalized internet. That's all I got. Thank you very much.